Well, good evening, everyone, and why don't we get started? I'm Marcel Acosta, and I'm the Executive Director here at the National Capital Planning Commission. I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome all of you to tonight's event. I'm really excited to introduce our guest, Patricia Brown, and she's been involved in a wide range of disciplines, sectors, geographies, all with a common thread of connection and partnerships. Currently, Patricia is the director of the London-based consultancy firm, Central. She works with a diverse group of clients covering issues on the dynamics of cities and the interconnection of businesses, public services, and communities. I want to just mention a few of Patricia's accomplishments and activities. She's a very well-known and well-regarded planner in London. She created the Big Think on London, which helped promote an understanding of the changing societal shift in living and working patterns there. She was also the deputy chair of the Mayor's Design Advisory Group, where she led its Good Growth agenda, focused on helping shape positive change as London grows. She's currently advising Transport for London on a strategic approach to design-led planning across its entire network and service delivery. She also consults to and teaches at New York University Shack Real Estate Institute with particular reference to placemaking and development, and is also a special advisor to the Times Squares Alliance. From 1998 to 2008, she was a chief executive at Central London Partnership, the private-public partnership for Central London, where she championed the need to improve urban design quality, paving the way to some of the capital's most significant urban changes. She also led the development of the UK's Business Improvement District movement and initiated Legible London on the capital's wayfinding system. That's a lot of work there. So I'm looking forward to tonight's presentation. Please join me in welcoming our guest, Patricia Brown.
Thank you, and thank you so much for the invitation to be with you tonight. So the presentation is going to be in sort of two halves. The first part is I want to talk to you about the sort of the London story that's been evolving over the past 20 years and the context to where we find ourselves now as a capital city and the challenge that London faces at the moment and where that is taking us in terms of our thinking for the city. And so, and then, you know, what I'll end on is these four critters, these four agenda papers, the Good Growth Agenda, which we've published from the Mayor's Design Advisory Group. Now, just a little bit of context about London. You will probably all know it in your own minds, you know, a picture postcard view of London, even if you've never been there. And you'll be aware that, unlike you, we are so not a planned city. The Romans rocked up, you know, and built a settlement around around a pool of London over 2,000 years ago and started to trade from there. And that set us off as ever since from being a commercial centre of what eventually became the capital of Britain. And we grew in a very sort of organic way and have continued to grow in a very organic way. And our street pattern is largely set out historically, and many of our streets are actually from the medieval times, including indeed even the city corporation, the square mile of London around the financial district, which despite the capital's devastating fire, which is being celebrated or honoured, the 500th anniversary of which is this year, and the plans to create a monumental London along the lines of your fair city, the capital just went back to its old ways and rebuilt on the medieval street pattern. So that causes us problems, which I'll be referring to. Now, a word about the way London is organised. The space of London, the actual footprint of London, comes to just under 1,600 square kilometres. And this is the boundary of London that you can see on the diagram. We have 33 local jurisdictions, local authorities we call them, which are administrative authorities in their own right, which deliver public services. Their local government functions include things like street cleansing, waste disposal, housing in some cases where housing is built, but that's a whole other story, which I try and cover. The education, for the moment, although the government is trying to take that away from local authorities, A large part of local road transport, so the roads, resurfacing, street lightings, a whole range of things. So the services that most people think as public services are run by 33 local authorities who all have their own political leadership, leaders that are party political that are voted in a 4-year cycle. Overlay that since 2000, when we got our most recent layer of strategic government, our regional government, Greater London Authority, came into power in 2000 with London's very first directly elected mayor. So we've had 4 terms of office. Boris Johnson, the current mayor, has had 2 terms and he is about to finish office next week. So we'll be electing our 5th electoral office of mayor next week. My mayor, when I say it, my Liverpudlian accent comes out well. So the Greater London Authority is the regional government for London, and it, and therefore the mayor, governs things like strategic planning. What is the overall direction for London? What should that be? And how should that apply to transportation and other wider strategic issues? But let's say for the transportation, that means that the mayor actually requires Transport for London to develop a strategic transport plan periodically, and Transport for London is our strategic transport authority that delivers transportation services. Unlike, I apologise, I don't know the system so well in Washington, but in New York, where the MTA and the DOT run the subways and the roads, we have Transport for London that runs both our underground, our subways, and takes care of what we think of as surface transport. And that is largely cycling, walking, more of which later buses and so on and so forth. And more recently, they've also taken over what we call overground surface rail as well. So it's a huge transport infrastructure, multi-billion pound agency, and the mayor is overall in charge of that. And there is a constant iteration between what the local authorities need to do and what the regional government has to do. And the London Plan is the planning document which actually helps dictate, taking from national policy, what local government need to do. So local government determine their own planning frameworks, but it has to be compliant with the strategy. And the document on the screen here is from our London Plan. And what the blue little sort of wigwammy things show is the areas of London that in the previous London Plan, 2008 or 9, I think it was, 2009, were designated for growth. They're called opportunity areas. And they're areas where we believed there was potential for growth in London, and growth in fact was required, and the local authority and the Greater London Authority works together to ensure that that growth is brought forward, developments can happen, a density and a scale is allowed there, and a certain number of houses and jobs go into it. The white, the ones which have got the outline and no infill are areas of intensification where some growth can happen and more intensity of use happens, but doesn't quite have the same policy framework. So with your sort of planning backgrounds and what you do, I thought that would be of interest to you. So there's an iterative conversation, and there's a lot more I could say, but in the interest of time, I'll carry on. Now, in my story here starts really with my story in my time in Central London Partnership in about 97, 98, when I first took on CLP as a startup organisation and developed its programmes and the board and funding. It was just me and a board. And we were started on an action plan for Central London to set the tone of what we were going to be doing over the next 4 years. And at that time, we really, when we looked at London, and especially the private sector members who'd set us up and backed us, you looked at London and didn't like what we saw, many of us. London had become a car-dominated city. It had become a city which had stopped thinking about itself and what it needed to be in order to plan. And this was largely, to a certain extent, but not exclusively, as a consequence of the lack of strategic government since Thatcher had abolished the Greater London Council in 1986. But it was also because we were growing, society was changing, and this was a typical sort of weekday on Regent Street when you could walk across the top of the buses and the lorries, etc., and it was just wall-to-wall traffic. And conditions around some of our major tourist attractions and sites, like this south side of Trafalgar Square, sort of heading towards our Mall, going towards Buckingham Palace. These were the conditions that we offered people who decided that they wanted to come to London. We penned them in because there wasn't enough space, because what we did was give all of our available road space over to cars. And this is the north side of the of Trafalgar Square, between the square itself and the National Gallery. And this is what this looked like in the late 1990s. And this is where the story of London's change really begins, because in the there was a proposal created by the government, central government, to create what we call the World Squares for All, a campaign to change Trafalgar Square. Now, if you were in one side of Trafalgar Square, the place I just showed you the photo of, and you wanted to get to the opposite, diagonally opposite side, it would take something like 9 minutes. And Tim Stoner, who's been here to speak to you, came up with that statistic, because it was Tim Stoner that did all the transportation and pedestrian modelling for Trafalgar Square. So if anybody heard his talk, this will sound familiar to you. So what we wanted to do is to take Trafalgar Square and make this a place for people, and turn it eventually into what it became. But it was a critical battle for quality and people within London, because there was, despite the fact that for lots of us this was a really important thing to do, it was actually a huge amount of pushback from the local authority that managed this space, Westminster City Council. It was a government-owned site, but it was managed by Westminster City Council. And when they consulted, there were about 40 residents who lived close by, who drove to the opera, who were going to take 2 minutes more to get to the opera across the square, and they didn't want it to go ahead. So these highly vocal lords and ladies, and I kid you not, lords and ladies, Baroness so-and-so and Lord such and such, didn't want this scheme to go ahead, and it wasn't going to go ahead because of these 40-odd people. And we put together a business lobby to stop this from happening. We got it in the mayoral campaign as the mayors were coming forward. But more importantly, a very clever planner, Joyce Bridges, came up with the idea of turning this space over to the Greater London Authority to manage at the point that the mayor came into office. So it stopped being Westminster's problem when it went wrong, which they believed it would, and it became the Greater London Authority's problem, the mayor, and it was looking very much like it was going to be a Labour mayor to manage a problem when it went wrong. However, it didn't go wrong. It was a huge success, and Westminster claim it was their idea right from the start. But a lot of my story is that success had many midwives. Now, I've dwelt on this because a little bit too much detail, because it was a really important part of the London story. And it took about 6 years from the get-go of 1996 of this of being created as a concept. Foster's did the master plan, to 2002 when it started to be actually executed in the ground, and about 2004 before it was actually opened. So it took a long time, and that is absolutely ridiculous, and we had to expedite it and do things differently. This is a view from the National Gallery. Around the same time, one of the schemes that the aforementioned wonderful Joyce Bridges came up with was taking all the car parking out of the Somerset House forecourt, which was being turned over away from government to become a cultural centre. And this scheme was developed by Dixon Jones, and it instantly became a place where anybody of any income group could go and spend time for free and just become lay down a towel and picnic, and if you wanted to go and see an art to the art gallery, then so be it. But these two things were important signifiers in the battle to make London a more walking and people-friendly place. And my organisation, Central London Partnership, led the rearguard action on that. We created a strategy, the walking strategy you see here, which said what we needed to do to create the conditions to make London be a place where people wanted to be, because they could walk with ease, they could feel as though the city was thinking about them, and it made the city felt as though it was putting a subliminal arm around them and saying welcome, rather than who are you, what are you doing here, which is what London was doing. So we, as part of this, we developed the first business improvement district, pilots initially until we got the legislation. This was Holborn, one of the very first ones in about 2001. But still that wasn't enough, and the major Jan Gale study that we had done in 2003, 2004 was done in order to get somebody else to give an independent assessment of London's conditions on the street for pedestrians and for being in London. And these are pictures from the study which showed Regent Street, this incredibly emblematic and important street in London, also a major retail destination. And this was what people had to do if they were tired after a day's shopping. So come and spend your money in London and we'll treat you like rubbish. So we wanted to change that, and we took people to places. We took people to Copenhagen. We talked about what change could be like. And one of the first advocates of that was the City Corporation, the Square Mile. And they started to take bits of space away, which were formerly car parking, which was no longer necessary, bits of street that was not necessarily that useful in the network, and turn it into places like this. This was, I think, done in about 2005, 2006. One of, as Marcel's already mentioned, one of the most important things we did, which took 5 years and a lot of pain, was convince the local authorities to create a wayfinding system that spoke right across the borough boundaries, a map-based system which Transport for London took on as Legible London. We led the charge for that. And if you go to New York, you'll see there's a version of this has popped up now as Walk NYC. And the private sector were the heroes of all of this story. Most of what I'm talking about has been supported by the private sector, championed by the private sector, and my organisation was largely funded by the private sector to achieve change. And they were the ones who first started to implement it and fund schemes when we wanted to start to actually do much more specific street treatments. So this is in Belgravia, not a poor area by any way, shape or form, but a not particularly sort of well looked after street. And Grosvenor, the landowner of this area, turned it from that to this as part of their comprehensive street scene programme, which was partly planned on the back of the Jan Gale study. They did a second study. So at-grades, crossings, better parking provision, better loading provision, trees, and just a sort of an upgrade of shop fronts as well. When Boris came in, he picked up the work that Ken Livingstone had started to do, but with a much more business-like focus, and created a strategy for the Greater London Authority, London's Great Outdoors, which then helped fund programmes which went into regeneration areas, so away just from the city centre, but championing the importance of places for people, taking redundant or taking scuzzy places like this in Hackney and transforming them. This is the opening, Gillette Square, into places which were multifunctional for people to use, for farmers' market, for play, for a whole range of things, in a very, at that time, poor neighbourhood, until the hipsters moved in and turned it into a very expensive neighbourhood. This is an opening of one of the streets that had been stopped off. They didn't do much, we just closed it to traffic. So one of the most iconic projects next to Trafalgar Square in London has also been the Exhibition Road project, which was gently in the background being planned all this time. And the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea led the charge on finding a way of transforming the street, which is a spine street amongst our cultural institutions, the V&A, Natural History Museum, so on and so forth, many of which I'm sure you'll have been to, going up towards Hyde Park from South Kensington. And they've changed this trafficked and Park Street into this. which is it was meant to be a completely shared surface. They fudged it in the end and I think compromised it. But nonetheless, it's a beautiful treatment. And now we're thinking, where next for Exhibition Road? The street work has been done, but what next? How do you programme it? What does it become? What do the institutions either side who are doing comprehensive redevelopment programmes also do to contribute to a sense of place within the area? That's another view looking north, up from the south section, more of which in a moment actually I'll come on to. I told you the private sector have been playing an important part, and this is a scheme in the Oxford Circus, it's Oxford Circus, where the Crown Estate, the Queen's Estate, which is managed like a proper real estate company with bringing asset value from the property and the land holdings that the Queen has. They own all the buildings in Regent Street and have been doing a comprehensive renovation and asset management of the street with top brands, really thinking, I likened it earlier to the Heinz development at the city centre district, thinking who do we want here and going out and getting it. And part of that for them was actually the revitalisation of the street, to take it away from those women sitting in the street doorway into a place where people felt as though they'd been thought about. And this is the Oxford Circus Diagonal, which was modelled on the Tokyo scheme, where people can cross across from all sides in one go rather than have to do all four sides of the square to get around. Amongst all of this change that I'm talking about physically, there's been another shift going on in London, a couple more shifts have been going on in London. And one of those has been a change away from where the centre of gravity of where people live and where people think of where it's at in London. And this is a diagram which is showing the population growth, predicted population growth moving east. Traditionally, most of the wealth has been in the centre and to the west of the edge, and the industrial east has been a very poor area, and that continues. But because it's been poor and because there has been people moving there because they couldn't afford to live in the west, because for reasons I'll come on to in a moment it's becoming a desirable place to live, the world is actually, the pole of gravity is moving to the east. And the Olympics, which regenerated a huge sort of swathe of former industrial land, has really helped actually accelerate that process. This is the Olympic Park with the, God rest her, Zaha Hadid swimming pool on the left-hand side. Now, one of the things that's actually accelerated that shift east to a certain extent has been the sort of change, the gradual change in our economy and the way we live. And I've just been having this conversation with Julia about DC as well. This unlovely space is called Silicon Roundabout in the branding terms. The government called it Silicon Roundabout. It's Old Street Roundabout, which is in the city fringe, adjacent to the square mile. Imagine swathes of light industrial, former sort of back office space, maybe storage space for city businesses. And they became places which became popular with architects and artists and creatives over a period of time. Oh, excuse me. And whilst we were examining our navels, thinking, oh my God, the world's come to an end because of the recession and the financial world is shrinking, the financial sector is shrinking, how do we rebalance the economy? The economy was quietly rebalancing in favour of tech and the creative industries. We've got a huge creative sector in Britain and London in particular. It's always been strong. And then the marriage of technology, IT, and the creative sector drove a major boom in London in the tech sector. And it was centred really around the city fringe, and hence the moniker Silicon Roundabout. And like so many other places, the tech and the creative industries, the architects and the designers were moving to places and had been moving to places for years which looked like this. This is a tea building in Shoreditch, bought by Derwent London for a song, and they were going to refurbish it and spend a lot of money into it. So they stuck a whole pile of advertising agencies and creative companies there while it was cheap, and those people loved it, and they realised that they were onto a gold mine, so they didn't really do much. They just did a very light refurbishment. And this is now, like so many others, a sort of an example of where people want to work in London. And co-working space and all of the stuff that you will be familiar with has really taken off. So our office stock and what occupiers want has radically changed. And this is a building on the left, on the right rather, which exists, and until about 2 or 3 years ago was headquarter of a company called Tech Hub, one of the drivers of the tech industry. And it was bought out by Derwent London, who are building the one on the left to join it, which is now called the White Collar Factory. So they're building this sort of tech space. And if Tech Hub wants to move in here, they won't pay the £6 per square foot they once paid. They'll be paying £65 to £70 to move back into the same office. Now, all of this, alongside all of this physical shift in terms of office demands, what has gone on alongside it is that these people are more likely to be on a bike and don't want to own a car, and the places where you get good coffee is what really attracts the people who are driving the economy in London these days. And therefore, what we need to think about and plan for in London is radically different in the face of growth. And this is sort of a theme of what I want to impress on you today. We want to build, lots of developers want to build shards, and lots of local authority leaders want to have our shards and the Renzo Tower building in the background. As an emblem of modernity and London's thrusting economy. But the reality is that it's the fine grain places such as Shoreditch, or in this case Bermondsey, with nice old pubs turned into groovy restaurants, and social housing cheap by jowl with loft space which costs £1 million to buy, and good restaurants which have popped up over the past few years, and parks and art galleries. This is a White Cube. And independent retail. This is a shop which sells high-end pet goods, and I said it would go out of business after 6 months, but 12 years later she opened a second one half a mile down the road. So the conundrum for London at the moment, for those of us who stop to think about it and care about these things, is we have growth, we have incredible growth, more of which in a moment. And we need to build at a scale that we've never done before. And the pipeline of developments were for large-scale developments. But the reality is that people flocked to the places where there were all the stuff underneath, the fine grain, the distinctiveness, the sense of place and the creative reuse. And that was what my big thing has all been about, is saying if that's what's important to people, how do we get more of that and make it happen? Now, the other things that are going on societally is the sharing economy, and the millennials, whether that's the right word or not, just live very differently to us. Me. I'm talking about here people in their 50s, people in their 40s. So cycling has taken off. And in all of this, what I wanted to sort of build up in what I've just been talking about is here we are in London. We've been changing the mood music in terms of what the city should be, what success looks like, public realm, walkability, quality sense of place, and distinctive neighbourhoods, etc. And we've been climbing up slowly, hammering away at the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, heading up towards self-actualisation. I'm feeling quite proud of what we were doing as a city. And then along came this thing called growth. And we realised that we'd actually put about 500,000 more people on in terms of population while we weren't counting properly. And London's population wasn't just under 8 million as we thought, but it's now 8.6 million. and 8.7 million, sorry, and that is increasing, we think, about 75,000 to 80,000 per annum every year, and possibly more as we're not very good at counting. That means something like another 40,000 households, which means another 40,000 homes for people, and the population is changing, more single person households, so different tenure and different mix. We need to find spaces for jobs, and we've been letting far too much of our employment land. We've been allowing 3 times more of our employment land that we've actually set in policy terms. So we're actually shedding employment land, and we're desperately trying to work out how we can accommodate both in the city. So we are now at a point where once upon a time we had organic growth, we now find ourselves in the point where we've got to achieve accelerated development, but all within the context of what I've just talked about. We want good places. We want to build places that have people at the heart of them, rather than at a scale where we don't feel as though we recognise the city we are. And when we last had our accelerated growth in the 1930s, we were unconstrained by this thing called the Green Belt, which came in after the war. So we built loads of swathes of suburbs. We don't have that luxury now. We're pretty full up, and we are constrained. And one of the debates is whether we actually start building on our protected Green Belt land. I still think there's a large amount of space we can use with our brownfield to be. Meanwhile, whilst we were asleep on the job within the planning departments, our developers were putting all sorts of permissions in for tall towers, which nobody had a database for, and nobody realised until New London Architecture counted was quite a considerable number in terms of pipeline developments. 234 when we first counted a few years ago, which went up to 436 when we counted a couple of months ago. So if all of those were built out, we would have more than 400 towers built of 20 stories more in London. And so this site on Blackfriars looking south to Blackfriars Road, which now looks like this, will look like this in about 5 years' time if all these permissions are built out. Now, what are these things doing to the ground plane? We ask ourselves, and what the developments as we see them so far are not exactly attractive on the ground plane. So we've got to do something about it. Here is another view, and that's what it will look like if the towers go ahead. Another one. So London is going to look remarkably different. Yet people like to go to places which are low rise and distinctive and fine grained. So how do we achieve this in the face of growth? One of the issues we've got about towers is that they pepper pot them all over the city where we can get away with it, because we have these things called view corridors. So you can't build within these red and yellow areas. So instead of having areas where you can cluster towers, you have towers where you can get away with building. So some of the work that's been going on inside City Hall is looking at how we achieve growth in different patterns, whether that's town centre intensification, the use of suburban intensification, just putting a bit more weight on in the suburbs, and where we can actually build in transit-rich areas. We've got a thing called PTAL, public transport accessibility, which shows where you can put in space. Many of our town centres have got good transit, so how do we accommodate more growth? So small town centres that currently look like this can just add a few more floors and start to actually take up some of the numbers in terms of housing employment space we need. This is the PTAL map. The light blue is the least accessible areas. How do you actually turn those into a brighter, closer to the red and the purples? So we're building transit. We've already got Crossrail 1 going on at the moment, which will be open next year. It took 60 years to plan, but fortunately it's only taken 6 years to build. And so once we set our mind to it, we're quite good, but it takes a long time to set our minds to it. London Overground is an old suburban rail system that Transport for London has repurposed. So that's been done. done very well. Crossrail 1 is being built. Northern Line Extension is a part developer-funded extension to Battersea, to the power station. A third of it coming from the fare box, a third from the developer, and a third from central government. Two tube lines will make two tube stops will make all the difference of that accessibility. And then some others, Crossrail 2, I'll come on to. And then part of this is walking and cycling. And a large part of what I did in the early part of this century was to convince that Transport for London, that walking and cycling was part of the transport mix. They didn't think it was to begin with. This is the route map for Crossrail 1. This is the route map for Crossrail 2, which is only at the feasibility stage at the moment. So walking and cycling, as I said, is a really important part of the mix. How do we get people off the very busy underground? They can walk. We can present good places. This is in the City of London. Wide pedestrian crossings at grade are being rolled out as much as possible. And most of our side streets now do have at grade sidewalks. So we're signalling all the time that people, it's a more walking friendly city. These are just in the suburbs as well. These are not local, the centre of London. So we're also pushing in some bi-directional cycle lanes. I know this is something you're planning as well, and we're currently tearing London apart while we put those in. It's hugely controversial because it's taking car space away, but we do have to put it in, otherwise people were going to continually be killed, which is, the numbers are really quite frightening. So this is going in across London at the moment. This is Elephant and Castle with some cycle improvements. And then there's this thing called tech, which has been changing the game, not necessarily brilliantly. This is a wonderful city mapper that I just can't live without these days, telling me how to get along, positive side of tech. And then there's this thing called Uber, which has added 80,000 extra car vehicles onto the road of London. And when you think that we already even though we actually started to get road vehicles off the road through congestion charge, growth has added even more. If you add tech and Uber and other things into that, we're at a standstill. And we're already killing 9,500 people a year through pollution-related deaths. And pollution is increasing because of the additional road use through things like online deliveries, another unintended consequence of technology. Everyone clicks at home and doesn't think that there's more white vans than ever on our streets. And we also have the issue of, this is the car, I put this picture, this is a rare beast, this is a car. So you hardly ever get sort of ordinary drivers in the centre of London because most of it is commercial traffic. You also get, because of the building boom, a lot of construction vehicles. And many of our construction vehicles, our construction sites are in the core of the inner city. So the centre of London is incredibly busy. So it's a frenetic, heavily trafficked space, yet we want this to become a place. And many of our major regeneration areas where the growth can happen, where we can put more housing, where we can put more jobs, are on the fringe of the inner ring road. This is Elephant and Castle, when the planners had their way with it in the face of modernity in 1960. The Luftwaffe bombed it to pieces, and then the transportation planners did the rest in the 60s. And it's part of the inner ring road, so it's the congestion charge boundary. And it's that inner ring road, you see, this is the sort of the planning, this was the equivalent of the sort of Robert Moses diagram for where the road should go. And the one on the bottom is showing where a lot of the intensification and regeneration areas are. And therefore we're building new places at the time when we're also, again, incredibly heavily trafficked, and we have to have movement of cars. I'm not anti-car, I'm pro-choice, and I think it's part of our jobs to enable the balance to happen in order to expedite movement and make a commercial centre work, but at the same time make it a great place for people. So one of the things that we did with a wonderful deputy mayor, an American called Isabel Dedring, who was deputy mayor for transport, global head for Arup now, by the way, if you want to hire her, transportation head at Arup. She came up with this idea of the roads task force, where we all got together and had a jolly good plan and think about how we could solve these issues. And one of the things that came up with was the notion of looking at the different bits of road and coming up with 9 different indicators and planning and assigning 9 street types to a particular road. So you would have some places which would only be a place. There would be a very low movement function. They only needed to function as a place for people to be and to sit and to walk in. Some areas were both a link and a place, like Regent Street. You wanted people to be there and to have an attractive environment, but they also had to function as a road artery. Or in some places, they are simply movement function. Incidentally, the blue on the right-hand side is the CGI of the bidirectional bike lane that we're thinking of hanging off the Westway, one of the major arteries in and out of London. If only we can work out how we can get people up and down it. We haven't figured that out yet. So this is a high movement function as opposed to a high place function. And these categories are being worked with the boroughs, looking at all the different roads, and we're using it, starting to use it as a planning tool and a way of actually, I think of it as putting a handbag on the dance floor, you know, a way to start a conversation about what a place should be. You all congregate round it and have a chat about this particular road and how it sits with the next bit of road, and start to think about what treatment you need to do, what needs to go, what needs to come into those spaces. Because we are at a tipping point, and this I said earlier, I'd come back to Exhibition Road, so despite £35 million of redesign, we are just, you know, too busy because it's such a popular area. And we have all these cyclists now, with 52% of all vehicle journeys on some of our key junctions are now cyclists. So I think that we are in what I call the red flag moment for movement in London, which is the same point we were at when we first got a motor car on the road and nobody knew what it was, and they put someone to walk along in front with a red flag, warning them that there was a car coming. We have to fundamentally rethink the way we move in London, because we simply don't have the space to move in the same way as we once did. There's too many people, there's too many cars, there's too many bikes, and the system doesn't work unless we actually think. And I've proposed, and it's been taken up by Transport for London, that we have to start with a new highway code for London. Maybe an informal one to begin with, and maybe something enshrined in legislation. But we cannot have every single cyclist thinking he or she is the only cyclist on the road, and dodging and weaving in front of cars, and the poor car driver thinking, which one of you am I going to kill? Because it is a really scary place to drive in London these days. Anyway, so this is our dichotomy. How are we going to balance this growth and the livability, which takes me to the good growth agenda? We're adding more opportunity areas and more intensification areas onto the London plan. So more areas need to put more people on. And in a place where we do have very few clusters of towers and very few dense areas, we're trying to get our head round how we accommodate growth, more buildings, more people, more employment space, more facilities like hospitals and schools and so on and so forth, and understand density. And this is a site in Isle of Dogs, which shows we haven't got our heads around density yet. If local authorities simply let planning permission simply because they think they want the money and they want the housing, this doesn't create a good place. So we are studying now how to create places that look like London and actually have what we call the London vernacular, but still allow us to build density. And these are just some examples, which takes me on to the good growth agenda. The 4 reports, which are asking ourselves, what are the conditions, what are the things, what are the policies, what are the questions we need to ask ourselves and answer in order to set the ground plane, the ground rules for good growth. We're not designing anything, we're not actually saying this is what, you know, the typologies completely have to be. It's more about what we need to know in order to achieve that to happen. And the first one is on growing London, and I'm just going to whiz through some examples of what we're talking about. We're looking at the issues for London. We asked people what they thought about the principal issues are for London at the moment, and housing came out to be absolute number one. We need to know where the growth can go, how to fit it into the low density neighbourhoods where the transport works, where our new transport is going to go. But we also already have quite a lot of stuff before we start building into the green belt that we could fill up a little bit more, a new space in a different way, in a flexible way. So rather than get building, let's get smarter. And technology allows us to do that. People rent all sorts of things out now. You can rent people's home for meeting space. You know, it's amazing what technology is allowing us to do. So let's be a smart city as we plan ourselves. How do we rethink density? What does density mean in a city that looks relatively low-rise like London? What are the different typologies this will mean? And then certainly it won't be that. We're doing a series of estate renewal programs already, taking relatively low-rise housing estates and turning them into higher density housing estates. This is a tenure-blind neighbourhood, so there's a mix of 60% social and 40% market housing within this new estate, which is just being rebuilt in a piecemeal way on an old housing estate off Portobello Road in North Kensington. Similarly, in Elephant and Castle, one of the areas of intensification on the inner ring road, taking large flatted developments and turning them into new estates with more people living there, but in completely different types of building stock. Again, high proportion of affordable housing. This is a Clinton climate change project as well, the only one in Europe. So these are just some CGIs, and this is what the first scheme that's been. A picture of one of the first phases. How do you deliver infrastructure? Most people don't know in London that the schools, their swimming pools and the doctor's surgery has a chance of being funded, in part at least, by the development that they've just objected to. So we need to understand the infrastructure costs of development and communities and the viability that adds on and the impact that has on density. What's the impact of tall buildings? How do we understand the cumulative impact? A whole range of things which I won't go into for time. One of the issues is how we manage density in public space. When the people on the left in those houses are paying a certain amount of what they call council tax for their public services, and their street is cleaned as a contribution from that council tax. Somebody living in one of the 98 apartments on the right-hand side is paying the same amount of council tax, and then they pay service charge to have their common parts and streets cleaned, so they're paying twice. How do we manage public realm? These are some of the schemes that are going on at the moment. What do we do to bring forward more public realm? What does public mean? We're not very good at building public lobbies in London, for example. So how do we make places look distinctive rather than have cloned spaces? How do we bring in the community voice to inform that? What type of places should public transport happen around, like public transit nodes and so on and so forth? How do you turn the everyday into something just quite magical? This is the new space around the Crossrail station at Tottenham Court Road. This is the Lend-Lease public park, which is being built around the scheme that I've just showed you. This is going to be the first phase. First biggest, the most significant public park that's been built in London, in central London for the past 70 or so years. How do you create places that's just for fun and joy? How do we fit an ageing population into a city? How do we make it age-friendly because a city that's good for older people is good for everybody. How do we see those people as a positive force for good and integrated into society through the way we build, so that you can have sort of intergenerational and entrepreneurial connections. This is a new development that's being planned. And then this is the last point that I want, one of the last points, which is how do we also get the skills to ensure that everything I've just talked about can happen in the rapid growth that we face at the moment. Most local authorities don't have enough staff because of in a cash-strained, constrained area. How do we ensure that we've got the, we understand the viabilities of projects and bring people in at the right time? So one of the things we've come up with is the notion of the London Place Agency to help people. I'll come back to that in a moment. This is a diagram which shows what happens if a developer gets a planning consent with a particular quality architect and then sells it on, and the lovely jelly on the left-hand side ends up looking like the one on the right-hand side by the time it's built. So, and one of our major things is developing the London Place Agency, which is a group of people from the private sector who could be seconded into the local authorities, urban designers, master planners and so forth, to support the local authorities in that growth and their visioning for the area. So this is just some statistics from the report. These are some of the people who've said that they'd sign up, some of the architects and urbanists who've already said that they would sign up to this, to the London Place Agency, to go in on secondment. And finally, and this is my penultimate slide, in all of this I haven't talked about culture and the arts, which is so fundamental to me. It's a whole lecture in its own right. But how in the face of growth, how in the face of all the change I've just talked about, how do we build a place that can just be joyful and allow for risk and amazing things to happen, like this Elizabeth Streb event back in 2011, and just be a place where people can do really surprising things. And on that note, I'll end, and I'm sorry if I've spoken for too long. Thank you.
Well, first, will everyone please join me in thanking Patricia Brown for just an amazing presentation. For me, I feel like I'm in one of those great planner geek moments where I've just seen so much information and I have so many questions, I hardly know where to start. But I'm sure that everyone else has at least a question or two, and Paul is here with a microphone, or if you're up here at the center dais, we'd love to take your questions for a few moments, so put your hand in the air and Paul will come find you.
No questions. The floor is yours, Julia.
Oh, the floor is mine. Oh, well.
Hello.
Well, the first question I had was, why did they stop the Greater London Council? Because I'm old enough to remember that, and it would seem to be a model for other countries, this country as well. And my second question is, I really didn't. It went so fast, and there was so much there. I just had a hard time fitting all the pieces together between the partnerships and the governments. I understand the multiple jurisdictions, I remember that, but I thought that had been overcome in a way. They couldn't stop a road from going through a municipality if it was there before. They couldn't just block it off, type of thing. They needed more, but I'm talking about another era, so I'm not understanding really about the individual powers that individual municipalities, I'll call them municipalities because that's what we call them.
Local authorities, yeah.
Yes, have, versus an overall body that is overseeing the total. So the balance of that and how that interaction occurs, and that seems important.
Okay. I'll stand here, actually, if I may. First of all, the reason that they abolished the Greater London Council is because the Tory government set them up, the metropolitan authorities and the Greater London Council became a metropolitan authority, which had powers assigned by central government. And then over a period of about however many years, they all became Labour authorities. So it was a blind ambitious act to get rid of Labour-controlled authorities. So they abolished them in 1974, 1986 rather, and the GLC and other things like Merseyside County Council and Manchester Metropolitan Council disappeared. So that strategic layer of local government or regional government was dismissed. To your second question, I've conflated various things here. A lot of what I've talked about are things which I've had a direct involvement or some form of influence in. And the partnership, Central London Partnership, whilst we weren't the only game in town, did a lot to convince local authorities and Transport for London to do things differently. But in all cases, it was an iterative conversation. You know, we set visions, we talked to people about what we wanted to achieve, we worked collectively to try and get people on the same page. And then those people were the ones who had to institute it because we weren't a delivery body. So in the case of, say, Legible London, for example, that was a case of convincing the 8 Central London local authorities to want to work together on a consistent wayfinding system. And then Transport for London enabling a study to be done and then giving us the powers to take that forward. So it was all a sort of backwards and forwards, not a linear conversation at all. But then once things happened, like the Jan Gale study that we had done, when that was adopted by the then Transportation Commissioner, Bob Kiley, another American, he wanted to ensure that that was enshrined in Transport for London's thinking. And it was both positive and a negative, because it was a negative because the traffic engineers he assigned it to didn't know how to take that forward, so they didn't do as much with it. The positive is that many of the attributes we wanted to get taken forward went into the funding agreements that Transport for London had with their local authorities. So the local authorities had to do certain things, like put those at-surface crossings in and things like that. So that was a way through funding compulsion that certain things happened. But this has been 15 years journey, and it's still a journey. And I was saying to Julia earlier, and I didn't mention it, I describe where we are as that we are at the end of the beginning of transformational change in London. And I think in major developed cities as well. And what I mean by that is the 20th century belonged to the motor car. And the end of the 20th century was saying, hey, this is bonkers, how did we get to this situation? And it's now only in the 21st century where we're figuring out what that means to get ourselves out of that situation. And that's pretty much accepted now. But we haven't quite yet got all the tools in the toolbox that we need to get ourselves out of that situation.
Thank you. So with the Central London Partnership, just a couple of questions. So that was formed...
You're only allowed one, Beth.
Oh, no, I have one and a couple of sub-bullets. So that was formed in the 90s?
Late 90s, 97, yeah.
So how was it initially funded, and who was your board? That's my initial question. And then how has it evolved today, and is it grown? Has it staffed? And
so good news, bad news on this one.
Okay.
It was somebody asked me that at lunchtime. It came about because there was an organisation called London First, which was a private sector-led lobbying group. That was one of the agencies that had come up in the absence of a regional government. And they and a couple of local authorities actually felt the private sector thought it would be quite good to have some better connection between the public and the private sector, because the public sector were just not at the table about thinking big in the late 90s. I didn't express that so much, but they were really had taken their eye off the ball. They were just in do the same as usual business. So a man called Sir John Egan, knighted for Jaguar services to industry by the aforementioned Margaret Thatcher, who was BAA chief executive. So he was a big private sector figurehead. he came up with the idea of developing something called the Westminster Partnership, and it grew out of that. So from the outset, it was a private sector-led organisation, despite the fact that it was a public-private partnership. And our legitimacy came from playing off, and I use that word advisedly, those words advisedly, working in partnership and playing off the two sectors, really, you know, the needs of both sectors. Much of the funding came from the private sector, and then when we started to get traction, we managed to get federal government funding or regional government funding for some of the projects. So Legible London, the study for that was funded by Transport for London, for example. When we were trying to get Transport for London to understand that the walking environment was part of the transport mix and they didn't understand it, I got some funding from Transport for London to do a study on the economic value of good walking environments, so we could lobby Transport for London to invest in good walking environments. So it was just the usual sort of boxing and coxing. What happened to the partnership, however, was by time after 10, 11 years of quite a lot of success, we were a very effective coordinating body for everybody, but very much a partnership. But Ken Livingstone was very jealous about the powers that the central London local authorities had, who were conservative. And he started to make life very difficult for us and started to sort of erode the notion of our boundaries. So whilst we weren't being attacked directly, it just became politically charged to operate, so we closed in 2008. Sadly. We need it, though. We need another CLP.
Thank you.
Okay. Oh, thank you. Hi. I just want to applaud what you have achieved, because I lived in London in the 80s, and I thought it would be lovely to take my mother to London in 2008, only to arrive to have President Obama arrive early because of the volcano in Iceland. Actually, it might have been 2010. And so I'm traveling in London with my mother, who was older, and we had to walk everywhere because of the motorcade and the road closures, and it was fantastic. And I don't know if you knew Ray Hoffenberg with Docklands. Well, she was one of the people that started the Docklands development from South Africa. And so I would go down and visit her when that was just starting in the 80s. So to see how the city has grown and changed, and I can tell you with my elderly mother, is so walker friendly now. It was so fantastic. So I just had to interject.
And you know, when we opened an exhibition, thank you so much for that. I once lived on the Docklands, and I used to end up taking a taxi home every night because I couldn't bear the thought of public transport getting from central London. It cost me a fortune to work and live where I did. Anyway, but it's transformed, and so much of it is down to the public. It is down again, in that sense, to the private sector investment. But I told a story at the opening of the Legible London exhibition before we started the programme. A couple of stories, and one was about a time when I was driving down Tower Bridge Road, coming off Tower Bridge, on Tower Bridge Road, and I saw a couple of women of colour, one of them elderly, one of them sort of early, probably 30s, and they just didn't look British, and they looked distressed, the elderly one especially, and they looked so distressed that I pulled my car over at a point where I could and went back and asked if I could help. And it seems I'd gone for a walk in London. They'd been to Tower of London, and they walked over the bridge thinking they could find their way back to where they needed to get to, visiting relatives in southeast London, and they were completely lost, and this woman was completely exhausted and just, took it out. So I gave them the lift to the station. And I told that story because I said I never, ever, ever want anybody in London to experience what that poor woman went through every day. And I think all of us that do the jobs that we do it because we want our mothers and we want our kids to actually have the best possible experience. So I'm so pleased your mother had such a good experience. But it's, it's for people like her that you do these things, isn't it?
Yes. Yes, and I think that all of us in this room who live in Washington, D.C., who have tourists and businesses and want to attract people like London does have to be so sensitive to all of these issues. But I was curious, is Pine Studios, because I have a lot of friends involved with movies, and
Pinewood.
Pinewood, is that in
That's
down?
just outside of.
I wondered.
It's outside of the Greater London area, but it's very much we embrace it for the economic statistics of London.
Yeah.
There was a question over there, wasn't there? Yeah.
I want to know a little bit. Can you tell a little bit about the strategy that was used to balance the increase in density and the public spaces and parks?
I'll come back in a few years' time and tell you what that is, because that's what we're learning. You know, it really is very much the documents that I've just set out is a work in progress, really. I think one of the questions that we need to ask ourselves in all of it is not just about sort of the strategy in terms of the amount of space per sort of density, you know, hectare or what have you. It's what that space is for. Because one of the things that's happened over the recent years is I always think that it's funny in London, people build apartments, but we all live in flats. I don't know anybody that lives in an apartment. They go home to their own flat. But people are developing apartments. So the private sector are developing apartment blocks, have placed a high value on public realm. But it's so full of blingy stuff, of hills and hummocks and pagodas and God knows what else. You can't use it. You can't just have a picnic or roll around or something like that. So you know, I think what we've got to focus on is what is usable space as opposed to ornamental space, really. So that's one of the things we want our public realm task force to take on. We'll come back. Will you invite me back? Hello.
Thank you. Excellent presentation, and I think all of us really value the trials and tribulations you all have gone through in London for how we live in DC and things that we maybe couldn't try to avoid. I was a tourist there back in the 80s myself, and I was looking at your pictures from the 80s, and it reminded me just of the congestion, and also about being the American who didn't know which way to look. As I went around Piccadilly Circle and almost died every time I went from one sidewalk to another. But my question is, in all the ability of being able to move off the transport, off those beautiful places and make those big plazas and places of placemaking, where did the cars go? Because did you also have restrictions on cars in the city, or did you raise taxes?
Yeah.
Like here in DC, they're trying to become a walkable city, and there are programs to try to limit us. But
Yeah.
what did you all do back in London to moderate that?
One of the things, there's so many things I could have covered, and one of the things I didn't cover is congestion charge, which was one of the most important bits of leadership, which was done by Ken Livingstone. It was in his mayoral manifesto, and he started on it as soon as his office began. So we introduced congestion charge within about 2 years of his first term. So when it was first implemented, it was an inner core, £5. Then it was increased to a slightly bigger core, and then actually that was reduced, that core, which included Kensington as well, but it was reduced by Boris because the bigger the core, the more people who could drive around for free in the core area, and that was a really important thing for London. That and also low emission zones, which have actually meant that we priced out through road pricing cars which were vans and vehicles which were polluting. The congestion charge has now gone up to, I think it's £11 a day. So it's gone in 12 years. It's doubled, and we're talking about increasing it. Where the cars went is the reason I pointed out the lone car earlier is there's hardly any private car use in London. It's mostly mini cabs, black taxis, commercial vehicles, people with some form of business within London. where did they go? Well, some of them went around the inner ring road and sort of circulated. Some of them just stopped driving. And I use myself as an example. I was one of those people who was really wedded to my car. I've lived in core London for quite some time, and I like personal mobility. But it was a signifier to me that this wasn't the right thing to do anymore. So at the point when I still had a car, I learned to aggregate all my journeys, so I'd do my dry cleaning, my shopping, and my having to stop off and get something which was a bit awkward, all on the same day, rather than do that right across the week, because I could. And so there's been a significant behaviour change in London. So that's what's happened to the cars. However, in the face of growth and the commercial vehicles I've just described, we are back to the same level of congestion, sadly. So, and that's what we've got to work on next. And my first attack is the Uber drivers.
Are commercial vehicles, I'm not talking about public buses, but delivery vehicles and
yeah.
trash collection vehicles, are they all subject to the 11 pounds a day, or is it just private vehicles? Are taxis subject to it when going in and out?
Taxis aren't, and Uber isn't. So it's ridiculous that if you become a private car, if you sign up to something like Uber or a minicab service, you can use the roads for nothing.
But they can also drive privately.
Yeah. We're working this one through at the moment, but the other commercial vehicles like delivery vehicles, trash vehicles. If you're a shredding company, for example, you pay. It's more for big vans, for big lorries, and it's private cars and private cars who emit below 100 grams. Of CO2 exempt as well,
so like
and that's
hybrids.
going to go. So hybrid. So we got a big rash of Priuses being bought in the very early days.
Now, what about the
going
people
to go.
living in the zone?
They get a discount. They get a 90% discount, which is why when we increased the actual congestion charge boundary, it increased car movement, because all the people in West London, in just to the west in Kensington, who were suddenly in the zone, had the freedom to drive into the West End to pay only at the time 50p a day.
Why didn't they have two zones?
They thought about having two zones, but then you'd need two lots of signages and two lots of cameras, and it all gets very complicated. So Boris took that out after 2 years. But anyway, it's a complicated story, and people are chipping away at private car use, and the most important thing in all of this, which is another thing to Ken's credit, he might have been the death knell for Central London Partnership, but he did do some good stuff, was he made he put massive amounts of funding into buses, because he couldn't get the investment into tubes fast enough to make to grow the capacity that we were going to need to get people out of cars onto public transport. So our bus service has changed radically, and where once upon a time Margaret Thatcher said that anybody, I can't remember precisely, but something that anybody that's worth their salt wouldn't travel on a bus. She actually put it more crushingly than that. So now anybody would go on a bus. It's a pleasurable experience. Getting worse though because of the congestion.
It was getting
shown. Yeah.
I think if I may ask then the last question. We've spent time in this agency and across the city addressing the issue of building height for quite some time, and so the slides that you put up were quite interesting, and I'd like to know sort of what the public discussion and debate has been around kind of this extraordinary number of new, very tall buildings, and if you could expand a little bit more on what sounds like the unintended consequences of having view corridors, and how that's affected.
Yeah, certainly.
And maybe the last part is whether or not those buildings are putting a dent in accommodating growth.
Yeah. So taking the last question first, of the I mentioned some statistics that we went from something like 230 tall towers when they were counted by New London Architecture to 434 now. Of the couple of hundred permissions that were given last year, only 9 of them have started. So we don't think they're making a dent. I don't really do believe that they're actually, as they are built, as they are planned, making a dent on growth. A lot of the high rises are aimed at the top end of the apartment market, and that's softening in London quite dramatically. There was a massive amount of building which was aimed at on the inner fringes, which like Battersea, for example, which were aimed at sort of high net worth individuals, and when starting prices are about £800,000 for a 1-bedroom or a studio, there's only certain people can do it. So we've got this thing called, this is a bit of a segue, but it's relevant. There's an expression called buy to leave, where people are buying property simply to have it as an investment, because with interest rates so low, that's how they get their returns. So that has really been fueling the towers. And as the market softens, there's a lot of those towers that won't be built out. To your question about the public discourse, there hasn't been one. And so these have happened incrementally, and because we've got 33 planning jurisdictions, the aggregate was only done when New London Architecture did it. And so nobody's come along and said, hey, Londoners, what do you think about tall towers? And what do you think about all these tall towers? And there's a campaign called the Skyline Campaign, which is actually asking for this very debate and asking for some form of commission that plans it, with also a model, a digital model for London that can show people what the aggregate towers would look like. And for more, and part of the work on the Good Growth Agenda is for more sophisticated modelling of things like wind tunnelling, both for the sort of, if you've got a cluster of towers, if you're only building one, but you're modelling the development for all of them, and the wind tunnel works this one, what's it going to be like for the 5 years while there's only one tower? All of those things we've got to work through at the moment, and we're asking. There was another bit which I can't remember, sorry.
The impact of the view corridor.
The view corridor, sorry. So it's, as I was saying, there are certain areas, where there's a combination of land that is available, stroke affordable, and nothing's affordable really in London now, and where development can happen because of the view corridors. So the slide that I showed was all the view corridors to the House of Parliament and the UNESCO site there, and St Paul's, which is the sacrosanct one, and they cut a swathe right through London. So if you're on Parliament Hill, which is in North London, about 4 miles to the north of the city, you have to be able to see to the House of Commons. That means the entire sort of corridor has to be at a particular height level. So you can't think where, as Longport might have been, how do we do this? How do we plan it? You're just thinking, I can do that there. And that's the effect that we're getting, the pepper potting.
I think with that, maybe just in the interest of time, can you all please join me again in thanking Pat for this great presentation?